On the coldest morning of the year, a woman opened her front door and found a strange dog just sitting there. No collar, no sound, just waiting. She let him in for one night. That should have been the end of it. But what happened next? It was nothing she could explain. The dog didn't leave, and neither did the feeling that something was changing. Stay with us because this story doesn't go where you think it will. The wind howled low over Willow Glen like a tired ghost that had forgotten how to cry. Snow floated down in lazy spirals over the peaked roofs and white frosted trees layering the town in a hush that only Vermont winters could conjure. It was the kind of morning that made even the crows stay quiet, their black shapes huddled on chimneys waiting. Outside the Whitmore cottage, a pale green Victorian with ivy frozen stiff along the walls, the world stood frozen still. And on the porch, half buried in snow, sat a dog. Inside the house, Sarah Whitmore stirred her tea absently, eyes distant behind gold-rimmed glasses. At 67, Sarah wore her loneliness like a shawl she never quite managed to put down. She was tall and slender, almost willowy in build, with a spine that remained straight despite the weight of grief she carried. Her silver hair was pinned in a tidy twist, and the soft lines on her face suggested both gentleness and loss like parchment that had once held poetry but had been folded too many times. She had once taught piano at the community center, her hands dancing with life across ivory keys. But after Arthur, her husband of 42 years, passed suddenly of a stroke. Last spring she closed the lid of her piano and hadn't opened it since. Since then, Sarah had spoken to very few people, and even fewer had spoken back. The world outside her windows went on living, but hers had stopped. As she sipped her lukewarm tea, something made her glance toward the front window. There, nearly swallowed in a curtain of white, sat the figure, still, watching. She squinted. A dog, German shepherd by the looks of him. His fur was caked with slush, thick winter coat, dulled with dirt and ice. He was large, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with a barrel chest and wide paws that had pressed clear tracks in the snow-covered steppes. But it was his eyes that held her. One golden, the other, a misty gray, clouded with age or injury, yet sharp with something almost human. Hunger? Yes. Weariness? But something else, too. Hope. Sarah blinked, shaken by the thought. "Go on now," she muttered aloud, setting her tea down. "I'm not what you're looking for." She pulled the curtain closed. She didn't look again for 20 minutes, but when she did, he hadn't moved. Not an inch. At first she thought she imagined it the tilt of his head, the slow rise and fall of his chest. But no. He was waiting. Outside, the snow thickened piling against the porch railing, ghosting the outlines of the dog's body, like the land was trying to erase him. She stood a long time by the door, one hand on the knob. The sensible part of her, a voice that sounded too much like her late husband's, insisted, "Call animal control. This isn't your responsibility." But there was a quieter voice too, one she hadn't heard in months. The one that played Debussy on rainy afternoons and used to leave peanut butter sandwiches for neighborhood kids who looked like they hadn't eaten. Sarah opened the door. The dog lifted his head. He didn't move toward her, didn't wag his tail or bark. He simply looked and waited. She hesitated. "I'm only letting you inside until the snow lets up," she told him, voice brisk. "Don't get any ideas." He stepped inside, each movement measured as though he understood the rules of politeness better than most people. Snow melted off him in slow drips onto the hardwood floor, leaving dark spots that would need mopping later. She closed the door. "Good Lord, you stink." He lay down quietly by the heater vent, curling into a ball. He did not whine, did not sniff about, did not even glance at the kitchen. Sarah fetched an old towel from the linen closet and dried him with careful strokes. As she worked, her fingers found the notches of old scars beneath the fur. His left ear had a small notch missing, and his front right leg bore the stiffness of an old injury. And then she saw the collar, worn leather. The brass tag was faded, the lettering almost illegible. She held it to the light and squinted. "Just one word, Charlie." "Well, Charlie," she said softly, "what are we going to do with you?" He looked up at her with those mismatched eyes, and something inside her cracked open like the first thaw of spring. The storm didn't stop until nightfall. Sarah fed him a bowl of leftover chicken stew. He ate slowly with dignity, and then she laid out a blanket for him beside the heater. She had every intention of calling the local shelter in the morning. But when she climbed into bed, the house no longer felt as empty. The silence, once so oppressive, now held a heartbeat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In her dreams, she stood in her old music room, fingers hovering above ivory keys. The room was filled with sunlight, and just behind her, watching patiently, sat a dog with one golden eye and one gray. She awoke just before dawn. Downstairs, Charlie was still there, waiting, like he'd always been meant to be. Morning came slowly with the faintest pink light seeping through the frost-laced windows. Sarah Whitmore stood at her kitchen sink, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug painted with faded blue jays. Outside, snow still blanketed the world in silence. The porch steps had all but disappeared beneath the soft drifts, and yet in the living room, the dog remained curled neatly by the heater vent, like a statue carved from memory and muscle. Sarah wasn't sure what she expected when she let Charlie in the night before. Perhaps that he'd paw at the door come morning, eager to leave, but he hadn't. He hadn't moved at all, not even to explore the house. He simply stayed where she had placed the blanket, breathing steadily, eyes closed, as though he knew it was safe at last. She lowered her mug. Well, she said, a loud voice softer than usual, "You're not exactly making it easy to say goodbye." Charlie lifted his head slightly, ears twitching, but didn't rise. His mismatched eyes studied her in silence, the kind that didn't demand anything, just witnessed. Sarah had already pulled out the number for the Willow Glen Animal Shelter. It sat scribbled on a notepad by the phone, where it had been since before breakfast. She glanced at it now, then at Charlie. What was one more day? Instead of dialing, she turned to the cupboard and pulled out another can of stew beef this time. I suppose even uninvited guests deserve a decent breakfast. Charlie didn't bolt for the bowl when she set it down. He walked to it slowly, tail low, posture humble, as if grateful for every bite. Sarah watched from her chair, and when he finished, he returned to the heater without a sound. The silence between them was beginning to feel less like absence and more like companionship. Later that morning, Sarah dressed in her wool coat and boots, the same pair she wore each Sunday when she visited Arthur's grave. She had skipped 2 weeks in a row now, not out of forgetfulness, but fatigue, the kind of tiredness that settles in your bones when you live alone too long. "I'm going to the store," she told Charlie. "Don't touch anything." The dog blinked once, then rested his head back on his paws. Willow Glen's town market sat at the far end of Main Street, nestled between a bakery and a second-hand bookstore that hadn't opened since before Thanksgiving. The air outside was biting wind, tugging at her scarf, as Sarah stepped out the sky, thick with low clouds threatening more snow. As she entered the market, the old brass bell above the door jingled, and a familiar voice greeted her. "Mrs. Whitmore, haven't seen you in a while." Behind the counter stood Lori Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown eyes and chestnut curls pulled into a messy bun. Lori was one of the few townsfolk Sarah didn't mind speaking to. She was gentle with conversation, careful not to prod where it hurt. A single mother raising 2 sons, Lori worked mornings at the market and evenings baking pies for the town diner. "Hello," Sarah replied with a small smile. "Just picking up a few things. Cold out today. Need anything special?" "Dog food," Sarah said without thinking. Lori tilted her head. "You got a dog now?" "No, I mean, he's not mine. Just visiting." Sarah rubbed her gloves together. "Found him on the porch. Couldn't let him freeze." Lori nodded slowly. "German Shepherd. Right big fellow, gray eye." Sarah looked up startled. "You know him?" "Not personally, but my youngest Ben swears he saw a dog like that around the schoolyard a few weeks ago. Said he just watched the kids play, never approached, then vanished." Sarah said nothing for a long moment. She took a bag of kibble from the shelf. "He's got something in his eyes," she said finally. "Like he's seen too much and still wants to believe the world's kind." Lori gave her a look that wasn't quite a smile, more like a kindness. Sometimes animals pick us for a reason. When Sarah returned home, Charlie was waiting at the door, not pacing or barking, just sitting, waiting. He rose when she entered and wagged his tail once, a subtle sweep like a bow of gratitude. She carried the bag of kibble to the kitchen and, without thinking, picked out a ceramic bowl from the top shelf, the one Arthur used for popcorn on movie nights. She filled it slowly and set it down. "You're still not staying," she told him, not unkindly. "I'm just being decent." Charlie ate again in silence, then returned to his place. That afternoon, Sarah sat by the piano for the first time in nearly 8 months. The room had gathered dust curtains drawn against light, the old metronome still tilted at an angle from when she knocked it over during Arthur's wake. She didn't lift the lid, yet just sat there, hands resting in her lap, eyes closed. Charlie padded into the room and lay down at her feet. She didn't play, but she didn't leave either. As dusk settled over the town, Sarah made soup and poured a bit into a separate bowl for Charlie. She watched as he ate as the fire crackled in the hearth, and the house, once so still, it echoed began to feel like it breathed again. That night as she climbed the stairs, she glanced back. He was there, not a guest anymore, not yet family, but something in between. Morning arrived on the heels of soft flurries coating Willow Glen in a shimmer of light. From her window, Sarah Whitmore watched the wind move across the snow like a hand brushing the land clean. She had always loved how quiet the world became after snowfall, how it muffled even the deepest aches in the chest. But these days, even silence could be exhausting. Charlie, the German shepherd she had yet to officially call her own, had made himself at home with the ease of a ghost that remembered the layout from another life. He was large and aging, though still sturdy with a deep russet coat dulled by time and hardship. His right leg still moved with slight stiffness, but there was grace in his stillness. He didn't demand, didn't intrude, he simply existed alongside her, like the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. That morning, Sarah moved slowly through the house, her joints stiff from the cold. Charlie followed at a short distance pause, making soft clicks against the wooden floor. She noticed him hesitate by the threshold of the music room. For a long moment he stood there, head slightly tilted, his breath visible in the chill. Then, almost deliberately, he walked in and sat beside the upright piano, an old mahogany Baldwin with floral carvings along its sides and a lace runner covered in dust draped across the top. The piano had been silent since the spring. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for the key lid. Her breath caught. Arthur used to sit right there listening, as she played Debussy or Chopin after dinner. It wasn't that she stopped playing because he died, it was that the music became too loud without him. Charlie sat quietly beside the bench. His golden and gray eyes were fixed not on her, but on the piano itself, as if he knew it held something buried. His ears were perked, not alert, but hopeful. Sarah sat. She didn't intend to play, only to sit to remember. But memory has a way of pulling sound from silence. Her fingers touched a key middle C and held it. The tone was faintly out of tune, soft with dust. Her breath hitched, then another note, then a chord, and then came the first line of Clair de Lune. Not practiced, not perfect, but real. Charlie's ears twitched. He didn't move, only stared at the floor, as if the music were something sacred, and he mustn't interrupt it. As the melody stretched out, Sarah felt a tightness break loose in her chest. Tears welled without warning, slid down her cheeks and onto the keys. Still, she played. The house, once hollow with grief, echoed with softness again. That night, Sarah left the piano uncovered. The next day brought a soft knock at the front door. Around noon, a sound so rare these days it startled her. Charlie lifted his head, but didn't bark. Sarah opened the door to find a girl standing there, thin as a wisp, in a faded lavender coat, with a rip on one sleeve. She looked to be around 9 years old, with long chestnut hair tangled at the ends, and large hazel eyes that didn't quite meet Sarah's. The girl didn't speak. Behind her stood a man, early 40s, with a rough beard and oil-stained jeans. His flannel shirt was open at the collar despite the cold. He removed his cap. "Afternoon, ma'am. Sorry to bother. We just moved into the brown house at the end of the street, the old Danner place. I'm Tom, and this is my daughter, Ellie." Sarah nodded. "Welcome to Willow Glen." Tom scratched his neck a little awkward. "Ellie here wandered off this morning. Found her sitting in your yard. Said there was music." Sarah glanced past them to the trees. "I was playing." First time in a long time, she added almost to herself. "She doesn't speak much," Tom explained gently. "Not since the accident last year. Lost her mom in it." He hesitated. "She's been different ever since." Sarah looked at the girl. Ellie was now staring at Charlie, who stood just behind Sarah's legs. The dog took a step forward and sat. Then Ellie did something unexpected. She knelt and gently laid her hand on Charlie's chest. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch, eyes half closed, as if to say, "I see you." Tom looked surprised. She usually doesn't. Sarah understood without words. Would she like to stay a while? He hesitated. "If you don't mind." So Ellie came inside. Sarah made hot cocoa. Charlie sat beside the girl like he'd known her forever. They didn't speak, not a word. But Ellie smiled just once, and Sarah swore it lit up the room brighter than the fire in the hearth. From then on, Ellie began to stop by every afternoon, sometimes with Tom, sometimes alone. She never said anything. She didn't need to. She would sit beside Charlie while Sarah played. Occasionally, she would close her eyes and sway gently with the notes. One snowy afternoon, Sarah found Ellie standing before the piano when she came down from the attic. The girl's fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain. Sarah said softly, "Would you like me to show you?" Ellie nodded. That was all it took. Charlie lay on the rug, eyes closed, as Ellie's small fingers found a melody. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. And in that house where grief had once settled like dust, something new began to grow. The snow had turned brittle underfoot, a crust of ice forming over the white layers that had blanketed Willow Glen for weeks. Icicles clung to rooftops like stalactites, and wind curled through the leafless trees, with a whistle that echoed against frosted windows. Inside the Whitmore house, however, warmth flickered in more than just the hearth. Sarah Whitmore had started baking again. Nothing elaborate, just banana bread, occasionally apple pie when the apples were on sale. She claimed it was to keep the oven running in this cold, but Charlie knew better. The old German shepherd watched her from his usual spot near the kitchen doorway, his ears perked tail still. He was aging, but with quiet vitality, his fur fuller now, with proper care, the limp in his right leg less pronounced. His eyes remained soulful, and deep, one golden and one milky gray. They saw more than anyone gave him credit for. The days had begun to follow a gentle rhythm. Sarah would rise early, make tea, feed Charlie, and play a few lines of music while waiting to see if Ellie would come. She usually did, always quiet, always alone. The girl had a fragile air about her thin limbs, oversized coats, and those hazel eyes that watched everything but rarely met anyone's gaze. Her hair, a dull chestnut, was almost always tangled, the result of a father more adept with engine oil than braids. Sarah found herself thinking of Ellie long after the girl left each day. Something about the way she pressed her hands to the piano keys, not to play, but simply to feel them, moved Sarah in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It reminded her of the first time she herself touched music after losing Arthur. Not to perform, not even to remember, but to survive. One morning, Sarah glanced out the window to see Ellie sitting by the fence at the edge of the yard, coat unzipped, scarf dangling her breath, curling in soft white clouds. Her boots had left careful little tracks through the snow. She wasn't expected that early, but there she was, knees drawn to her chest-chin, tucked between them. Sarah opened the front door slowly. "Ellie?" The girl didn't respond, didn't turn. Charlie stood from his spot and ambled toward the doorway. Without needing instruction, he stepped outside, his heavy paws crunching on the frost. He approached Ellie not like a pet greeting a child, but like a soldier nearing another survivor. No wag of the tail, no bark. He simply lowered his head and stood beside her, then sat in the snow with a patient dignity. Ellie looked at him. A long pause passed before she reached out her mittened hand and touched the side of his neck. Her fingers slid into the fur gently, cautiously. She didn't smile, but her shoulders lowered a fraction, the tension easing. From the doorway, Sarah watched. Something in her chest caught and stayed. Later that day, when Tom came to pick Ellie up, Sarah finally stepped outside to speak to him. Tom Bennett was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with hands that bore permanent grease stains, and a look in his eyes that spoke of exhaustion, responsibility, and quiet effort. He was polite, perhaps too much so, with a habit of apologizing before he spoke. "I hope she's not bothering you," he said, stepping out of his old pickup truck. The vehicle was a faded green Ford Rust along the wheel. Wells' windshield cracked in one corner. "Not at all," Sarah replied. "She's welcome here." Tom rubbed the back of his neck, eyes on the ground. "She doesn't talk. Not since the accident. The doctors say she physically can, but, well, some things are harder than speech, you know." Sarah nodded. "She listens. That's just as important." They stood in silence for a while, the kind that didn't demand filling. Then Tom asked, "The dog?" "Charlie, right, he yours." Sarah hesitated. "He's with me." Tom looked at the porch where Charlie now lay. "Ellie smiles when she talks about him. Not out loud, but you can see it. It's something." That night, Sarah pulled a faded blanket from the hallway chest, embroidered with golden thread and still smelling faintly of cedar, and laid it across the spot near the piano where Ellie liked to sit. Charlie patted over, gave it a sniff, then circled twice before laying down atop it, his body stretched comfortably, tail flicking once in contentment. It was the next afternoon when it happened. Ellie came again, same as always, bundled in her too large coat, fingers curled tightly around the zipper. She didn't knock anymore, just let herself in. Charlie met her at the door, led her to the music room. Sarah was already at the piano, playing a gentle piece from Sadie, soft, repetitive, meditative. Ellie sat cross-legged on the blanket and leaned back against Charlie's warm side. Halfway through the piece, Sarah heard something. A sound. It was small, like a whisper or a breath catching in the throat. She glanced down. Ellie's mouth was open. Barely. Her lips formed something close to a hum. It was so quiet it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. Sarah stopped playing heart-thudding. Ellie looked up, startled by the silence. Her hand reached out suddenly and rested on the edge of the piano. She didn't speak again, but she didn't look away either. Sarah, blinking back tears, simply nodded and continued to play. That evening, as the sun dipped below the frozen trees, casting gold across the snowdrifts, Sarah wrote 3 words in her journal, the first entry since Arthur's passing. She is healing. The wind had shifted again in Willow Glen, turning bitter and sharp like broken glass. It crept through the trees with a quiet vengeance, slipping under doors and hissing between the cracks of old window frames. Sarah Whitmore, bundled in her wool cardigan and long gray skirt, moved through her kitchen with deliberate care, spooning warm stew into 2 bowls, one for herself and one for Charlie. The German Shepherd waited patiently at the foot of the counter, his grizzled coat catching the amber glow of the kitchen lights. He no longer limped as badly, thanks to daily walks and the slow return of strength, but his movements still carried the caution of someone who had learned the world could be unpredictable. That evening, snow began to fall again, thick and soundless. Sarah stepped onto the porch, the scent of pine and frost sharp in the air. Across the street, the lights in the old Danner house flickered through the trees. She watched for a moment, then turned to Charlie, who stood beside her. Let's play something for her. The music room had become a ritual, now an offering. Sarah would play, Ellie would listen from her window across the narrow street. They had never spoken during these evening concerts, but the connection was wordless and sure, like an invisible bridge strung between 2 hearts. Charlie lay beside the piano as Sarah played a haunting lullaby-like melody from Schumann, slow and aching. It floated out into the night like breath, and in the dimness beyond the frost-laced window, Sarah could make out the faint outline of Ellie's small figure, sitting on her bed, backlit by the soft glow of her desk lamp. Her hands were folded in her lap, eyes closed, listening. When the last note faded, Sarah stayed still for a moment, fingers hovering above the keys. Then she stood and turned off the lamp, leaving only the fire's glow in the living room. Charlie followed his steps, soft as shadow. Around midnight, a sudden unnatural silence crept into the room. The hum of the refrigerator cut out. The heater died. The old grandfather clock stopped its ticking. Sarah opened her eyes, still in her reading chair. A power outage. She stood and walked to the window. Across the street, the Danner house was dark. Then came a soft knock at the front door. It wasn't frantic, just hesitant, like hope trying to ask permission. Sarah opened the door to find Charlie gone from his bed. Snow whipped around her porch in swirling gusts. Through the flurries, she caught sight of him. Charlie standing in front of the Danner house, tail still, ears forward. She didn't need to be told. She crossed the street slowly, her boots crunching over the frozen ground. When she reached the porch, she saw Ellie sitting on the top step, arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her face pale and frightened. Charlie sat beside her shoulder, till her back pressed close enough to share his warmth. Ellie looked up as Sarah approached. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. Sarah knelt. "Did your dad leave?" Ellie nodded once. Tom sometimes took evening shifts at the auto garage in town when things got busy after storms. "The power's out," Sarah asked gently. The girl nodded again. Sarah looked to Charlie. He met her gaze without moving. She recognized the message in his eyes. She doesn't want to be alone. "Come with me," Sarah said, rising. "Both of you." She held out her hand. Ellie hesitated, then reached up and took it. Inside Sarah's home, the generator hummed to life in the basement. Sarah poured hot chocolate and wrapped Ellie in an old woolen blanket with sunflowers stitched along the hem, one she hadn't used since Arthur's hospital stay. Charlie lay at Ellie's feet, warm and immovable as a hearthstone. They didn't speak. Sarah didn't play music. But the silence was no longer empty. Sometime past 1 in the morning, headlights swept across the living room wall. A moment later, the door opened and Tom Bennett stepped inside, his face tense with panic. He was still in his garage overalls, snow clinging to his shoulders. "Ellie." She stood from the couch and walked to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. Sarah stood in the corner, hands folded. "I'm so sorry," Tom said when he looked up. "I should have known the outage would scare her." "She's all right," Sarah said. Charlie kept her company. Tom's eyes met hers. "You too." A long pause hung between them, not uncomfortable. She doesn't do that with anyone else, you know, he said. Not even her teachers. Charlie's different, Sarah replied softly. He doesn't ask for anything. Tom glanced down at the dog. Do you know where he came from? No, she said. But I'm beginning to believe he came for something. Tom exhaled, then gave a small, almost shy smile. I know we haven't talked much, but if you ever want to stop by the garage, I've got an old record player and some jazz LPs. Ellie likes it. You might too. Sarah smiled gently. I'd like that. When Tom and Ellie returned home, Charlie didn't stay behind. He followed them to the door, then turned to look at Sarah once more before disappearing into the shadows of the porch, his job done for the night. Back in her house, Sarah sat by the fireplace, her hands curled around a warm mug. The wind outside had quieted, and in the calm, she thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks. It wasn't a song tonight that brought comfort. It was simply presence. The late February sun filtered through the tall windows of Sarah Whitmore's parlor, casting golden rectangles of light across the worn carpet. A faint scent of orange peel and cinnamon hung in the air, lingering from the batch of muffins cooling on the side table. The snow had finally begun to recede, giving way to glistening sidewalks and the distant drip-drip of thawing gutters. Willow Glen was stirring from its long winter nap. Sarah, tall and composed in her long navy cardigan and slate-gray slacks, moved about the room with quiet precision. Her silver hair, usually pulled back in a clip, now flowed loosely past her shoulders. She looked younger today, or perhaps just lighter, like the weight she carried had shifted slightly, no longer bearing down with such relentless finality. Charlie lay stretched across the floor near the piano, his head resting between his outstretched paws. His coat, now clean and brushed to a dull sheen, caught the sunlight in warm tones of sable and gold. His breathing was slow, steady, still a sentinel, but a relaxed one. The room was warm, not just from the fire or the spring-like sunlight, but from the anticipation humming beneath its surface. For the first time in over a decade, Sarah had invited people into her home for a concert. Not a formal affair, no polished invitations or tight rows of folding chairs. Just neighbors, friends, and a few curious strangers. Some had heard about the woman on Maple Street who played piano in the evenings for a little girl and a dog. Others came because it had been too long since any music echoed from that end of town. By 3 in the afternoon, the room was full. Not crowded, but comfortably humming. There was Mrs. Abrams, the retired librarian, with thick glasses and a crocheted shawl shaped like an owl. Reverend Paul in his usual brown corduroy jacket and frizzy beard. And Harold Linney, the postman still in uniform. He stood awkwardly near the back, holding a thermos of cocoa like a peace offering. Tom Bennett sat on a wooden bench near the corner, his daughter Ellie beside him. Tom looked tired but grateful in a plaid shirt that had seen one too many garage shifts his hands clean for once. Ellie wore a pale green dress with small embroidered leaves at the hem. Her hair had been brushed messily but lovingly. She clutched Charlie's leash in one hand, even though the dog wasn't going anywhere. Sarah stepped to the front of the room and placed her hands gently on the piano's surface. The polished wood gleamed freshly oiled, no longer buried beneath dust and silence. "Thank you," she said, voice steady though quiet. "I haven't done this in a long time, but I think we all need a little music right now." She sat, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Then she played. It wasn't dramatic or showy, no grand gestures, just Sarah and the keys and the aching familiarity of melody filling the space between strangers. She moved from Debussy to Satie, to simple lullabies she used to play for the neighborhood children when they came for lessons. The room swayed gently with each note. Even those who didn't understand the names of the pieces knew the feeling in their chest. Charlie, lying beside the piano like a sentry, watched the audience as much as he listened. His ears twitched occasionally, but he didn't move. Several times children reached out to touch him, and he remained perfectly still, a monument to patience. Sarah glanced once at Ellie, during a soft run of notes, watching her sway gently to the rhythm, her eyes distant but clear. The girl had been improving, still silent most days, but more present. She painted now, often bringing watercolor sketches to Sarah's house, dogs, trees, and once a piano surrounded by stars. As Sarah moved into the final piece, Claire de Lune, the hush in the room deepened. Moonlight and sound drifting and fragile. Her fingers brushed the keys like breath against glass. And then in the second passage something happened. Ellie's mouth parted slightly. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Sarah's hands. And with the quietest voice, barely more than air, she whispered, "Mama." The sound was so soft that for a second Sarah thought she had imagined it. But Tom had heard it too. His head turned sharply. His mouth opened. Ellie didn't say it again. She didn't need to. The room felt it. Sarah played on her hand steady even as her eyes glistened. And when the last note lingered in the air like a kiss on a closing door, no one spoke for several seconds. Then came applause, not loud, not thunderous, but warm and real. Tom had tears in his eyes as he knelt beside his daughter. He didn't ask her to repeat the word. He just pulled her into his arms, pressing his lips to her hair. Sarah sat quietly on the bench, her hands still over the keys. Charlie moved, then finally rising, stepping forward to sit beside her like a noble companion. And in that moment, the room felt complete. Afterward, people lingered. Mrs. Abrams brought a jar of preserved cherries she insisted Sarah keep. Reverend Paul asked about hymn arrangements. Even Harold the postman stayed long enough to finish his cocoa and offered to fix the wobbly front porch step one of these days. But Sarah's attention stayed mostly on Ellie, on the girl who had said nothing for nearly a year, until the music gave her back one word. Later that night, long after the guests had gone, Sarah sat in her chair by the window. Charlie lay at her feet, Ellie's leash still curled near his paw. Sarah wrote in her journal again. 3 more words. She came back. The days grew longer in Willow Glen, and with each additional hour of sunlight, the town seemed to thaw not just from winter's grip, but from something deeper. Where once there had been silence and distance now, there were footsteps, voices and music. Sarah Whitmore, the tall, silver-haired woman once known for her solitude, now found herself hosting company almost daily. Her upright piano, once quiet and closed for years, was now open and warm beneath the gentle touch of fingers both young and old. The music room had transformed into something between a sanctuary and a small salon, a place not just to listen, but to breathe. It started after the concert. Word spread first in hushed whispers, then in earnest conversations at the town diner and post office. Did you hear about the woman on Maple Street? The one whose dog healed the girl? They say the music brought her voice back. And perhaps it was true. Or perhaps the truth was simpler and more magical all at once. A house, once hollowed by grief, had become a hearth. Charlie, the aging German shepherd, who had first appeared as a stray with one golden eye and one gray, had become something of a town legend. People spoke of how he would sit beside children, too anxious to speak, how he would rest his head on the lap of widows who'd lost their husbands, how he would simply be silent, still and deeply present. On a Tuesday morning, Sarah found a young man in his 20s waiting by her porch steps. His name was Daniel Reyes, a music teacher from the next county dressed in a corduroy jacket and jeans, with thick curly hair and a nervous boyish smile. He had heard about the concert from a friend at the community college and asked if he might listen or perhaps play. He was followed a day later by Mrs. DuPont, a retired nurse with trembling hands who hadn't played in years, and then by Sam and Josie high schoolers who brought their violins after hearing Sarah welcome all kinds of music into her living room. Sarah adjusted to it all with quiet grace. She brewed more tea, laid out extra cushions, and never once asked anyone to leave. Still, she never called it a club or a gathering. She simply hung a single lantern on a shepherd's hook outside her front door. It was small and glass-blown, shaped like a tear with a warm amber glow that never went out even on windy nights. When asked about it, Sarah simply said, "If you see the light, you're welcome to come in." People did. They came after bad days at work, after arguments, after funerals, after nothing more than a heavy morning they couldn't quite shake. Sometimes they came to talk. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just sat in silence beside Charlie and let the music carry them somewhere safer. One such visitor was Rebecca Lang, a woman in her 50s with short-cropped silver hair and a weathered flannel coat. She had been a local postal clerk before retiring early due to a heart condition. Quiet by nature, Rebecca had never spoken more than a few words to Sarah before. But now she came twice a week, always with a notebook and pen. She didn't play music. She simply wrote poems, letters, bits of memory, and once a simple note she left behind. "Your house reminds me of the ocean, calm on the surface, but full of depth." Ellie continued to visit often, always with Charlie close by. Her words, though, still few, were growing in confidence. One afternoon, she asked to play a piece on her own. She sat at the piano legs dangling above the pedals and played a soft, halting version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. No one interrupted. When she finished, Charlie pressed his snout gently against her arm. Tom, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, didn't say a word. His eyes said everything. Sarah watched it all with a kind of wonder. She had not intended to become a host, a guide, or a keeper of stories. but somehow this had grown around her not through force, but through kindness. One evening, as she stood on her porch with Charlie beside her, she looked out over Maple Street. A few houses had lights on. She could hear faint music from a radio down the block. The wind had warmed, carrying the promise of spring. Charlie let out a soft, almost contented sigh, lying beside her feet. Sarah reached down her fingers, resting gently on the fur behind his ears. "You came here for a reason," she whispered. "And maybe I didn't know it at the time, but I think I needed you more than you ever needed me." The lantern beside her glowed against the dark, a small beacon for anyone who might be looking for light. That night, as Sarah wrote in her journal, she paused for a long moment before penning a single line. "We become home for each other in ways we never expect." And the light stayed on. Spring crept into Willow Glen like a song hummed under one's breath, slow and full of quiet surprises. The snow had melted into memory, leaving behind muddy roads, early blossoms, and the sweet scent of thawing earth. Trees stretched their arms skyward again, and robins returned to the power lines with gossip and music. At the edge of Maple Street, the old Whitmore house had changed too. Its shutters were freshly painted, the front steps no longer creaked, and the garden beds, once dry and weedy, were now speckled with tulips and pansies that leaned into the sunlight. But what changed most wasn't what could be seen from the outside. It was the rhythm, the warmth, the breath of something living inside. Sarah Whitmore moved through her days with renewed softness. Her tall, willowy frame still carried the grace of a woman shaped by solitude, but now her movements held intention. There was less hesitation in her hands as she arranged sheet music, less weight in her shoulders when she opened the door to yet another visitor. Her once muted smile now reached her eyes more often, and her laughter, soft, careful, and real, had returned. She'd called it a joke. At first, the name tossed out one evening when a teenager asked if the lantern meant the music club was open. But the name stuck. The Porch Light Club. It wasn't official. There were no rules, no dues, no sign-up sheets. Just the little glass lantern flickering on the front porch. When it glowed, the door was open to stories, to silence, to sound. Some came to play music. Daniel Reyes returned, often bringing students of his own. Others came just to listen or to sit quietly with Charlie, the German shepherd who had become the beating heart of the home. Charlie, once a shadow at Sarah's doorstep, now belonged to everyone. Or perhaps more truthfully, everyone now belonged to him. His fur had lightened with age silver, threading through the dark. His movements were slower, and sometimes his breaths grew heavy after long days. But his presence, steady, warm, and deeply attuned, was stronger than ever. Children no longer hesitated to rest against his side. Elders leaned their hands on his back when standing. Teenagers sat beside him on the floor, whispering things they couldn't tell anyone else. Charlie listened to them all, with his mismatched eyes carrying their secrets like a sacred bond. Ellie Bennett, now nearly 10, had begun helping Sarah with the tea tray and guest cushions. Her voice, once a rare treasure, had grown into something fragile but confident. She spoke in full sentences now, carefully, softly, and occasionally even joked with the older guests. Her favorite sentence overheard often was, "Charlie knows everything." Her father, Tom, still came by on Friday evenings after his shift at the garage. He'd bring leftover cookies from the diner or new bulbs for the garden. He rarely stayed long, but he always sat for one song, usually at the edge of the room where he could watch Ellie play, now able to perform beginner-level duets with Sarah. One Saturday, something unexpected happened. An unfamiliar car parked by the curb, a dark blue station wagon with out-of-state plates. A woman stepped out mid-30s wearing a denim jacket over a summer dress, her auburn hair braided down her back. She approached the porch slowly, a bit hesitant, like someone unsure if they were interrupting something too intimate. Sarah met her at the door. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "Is this where the dog lives, the one people write about?" Sarah nodded gently. "This is where Charlie lives." The woman exhaled. "I read about him in a community newsletter 2 towns over. My son, he's been struggling. I thought, maybe we could just sit for a while." Sarah stepped aside. "If the light is on, you're welcome." Inside, the woman's son, a boy of around 6 with restless hands and a permanent furrow in his brow, sat rigidly on the floor. At first, he avoided everyone, but Charlie, as if summoned by something unspoken, walked over and lay down beside him without a sound. 10 minutes later, the boy was stroking the fur on Charlie's back, humming softly to himself. His mother wept into Sarah's shoulder, whispering, "It's the first time he's let anyone touch him in months." That night, Sarah stood beside the piano, her fingers tracing the worn wood. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing stars around a sketch of Charlie and the lantern. Tom was out back, adjusting the porch light's wiring. Charlie lay in his usual place, eyes closed, one ear still twitching, as if always halfway listening. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands moving carefully through the fur behind his ears. "You didn't just save me," she whispered, leaning close. "You lit a fire in this whole town." Charlie opened his eyes just briefly. A deep breath rumbled through him. Then he closed them again, at peace. The lantern on the porch glowed well into the night, not just because the light stayed on, but because the house behind it had become something more. A place where no one had to pretend to be fine. A place where grief met grace. A house of many hearts. Sometimes healing doesn't come with loud words or grand gestures. It comes quietly through presence, patience, and the courage to open your door to something unexpected. In our busy lives, we often overlook the quiet moments that could change everything. So, ask yourself, what if the kindness you show today becomes the light someone else carries tomorrow? Let us know in the comments if you've ever had a moment where an animal or stranger changed your life in a way you didn't expect. And if this story moved you even just a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that warm the heart and remind us what really matters.